Johnny Carson's most out-of-control guest moments ever. For 3 decades, Johnny Carson wasn't just a television host. He was the unflappable king of late night, a figure of stability who anchored the American evening. He was the consummate professional, a man who possessed the rare ability to charm presidents, calm down nervous starlets, and trade witty banter with the sharpest comedians in the world without ever breaking a sweat. His show was designed to be a safe harbor, a well-oiled machine where the audience knew exactly what to expect. A monologue, a swing of the golf club, and polite conversation. He was the master of the format, seemingly maintaining effortless control over every single moment that was beamed into millions of homes. But even the greatest host in television history occasionally met his match when guests went completely off the rails. Behind that famous smile and the air of authority lurked moments of pure television chaos that no one saw coming. There were nights when celebrities ignored the unwritten rules of the talk show format, descending into behavior so shocking that even the unshakable Carson couldn't hide his genuine discomfort. These weren't just bad interviews or awkward pauses. They were moments where the script was thrown out the window. The producers were panicking in the booth, and the host was left scrambling live on air to save the show. We are talking about jaw-dropping incidents that range from drunken tirades to actual physical altercations right on the set. There were shocking sexual comments that had the network censors sweating, and dramatic walkouts that left the guest chair empty on live television. These were the guests who pushed Carson to his absolute limits, testing his legendary composure in ways that made the audience gasp as much as they laughed. It was raw, unfiltered, and often teetering on the edge of total disaster, creating unforgettable moments of late-night insanity that have become legendary. What makes these moments so fascinating to watch now is that they happened in an era before publicists micromanaged every single celebrity appearance. Today, every word is rehearsed and every move is calculated. But back then, these wild, unpredictable encounters created a kind of raw television magic that would be impossible to replicate in the modern age. There were no safety nets, no quick edits to save a star's reputation, and often, no way to stop the train once it had left the station. You were watching real human volatility play out in real time, with Johnny Carson standing right in the eye of the storm. Today, we are revealing the specific moments when Johnny's famous composure was shattered by guests who weren't just eccentric, they were absolutely unhinged. From the stars who destroyed the physical set, to the legends who destroyed their own careers in a matter of minutes, these are the encounters that made Johnny Carson earn every penny of his legendary salary. Get ready to see the king of late night lose control, because we're counting down the most out-of-control guests in Tonight Show history. It is incredibly rare to see a host lose physical control of their own set, but that is exactly what happened in 1974 during what was supposed to be a simple, lighthearted interview. Johnny Carson generally loved having Burt Reynolds on the show. At the time, the mustachioed sex symbol was charming, quick-witted, and told great Hollywood stories that the audience adored. But on this particular night, Reynolds appeared alongside his close friend, the chaotic comedian Dom DeLuise, and the energy shifted immediately from a standard talk show segment to something far more volatile. While Carson was the master of verbal sparring, he was completely unprepared for the physical anarchy that was about to unfold. The trouble began innocently enough, or so it seemed. DeLuise, known for his physical brand of comedy, had brought a can of whipped cream onto the set, ostensibly to demonstrate a cooking technique he was famous for. But mischief was clearly on the menu from the very beginning. DeLuise winked conspiratorially at Reynolds while explaining his culinary expertise to Carson, signaling that the whipped cream wasn't destined for a dessert. Carson, with the prescience of a man who had hosted thousands of celebrities, sensed the danger immediately, remarking, "I have a feeling this isn't going to be about cooking." He was right. Without warning, DeLuise bypassed the food entirely and began spraying the whipped cream directly at Reynolds. Reynolds didn't hesitate for a second. He instinctively grabbed a pitcher of water from Carson's desk and emptied the entire contents down DeLuise's pants. The audience erupted in shocked laughter as the two friends engaged in what quickly became an all-out food fight. Initially, Carson seemed amused by the hijinks, watching from the safety of his desk as his guests made a mess of themselves, but his safety was an illusion. Caught up in the adrenaline of the moment, Reynolds grabbed the can of whipped cream and turned it on the host, spraying a thick white line directly across Carson's immaculate suit. That was the moment the laughter changed. Carson exclaimed, "That's a $500 suit." A rare moment of genuine irritation breaking through his professional demeanor. The set had descended into complete anarchy. Tonight Show writer Pat McCormick later recalled that while Johnny kept smiling, anyone who watched him regularly could see the difference between his real laugh and his "I'm going to murder you" during the commercial break laugh. By the time the segment ended, the famous Tonight Show carpet was soaked, the desk was dripping with cream, and Carson's suit was ruined beyond salvation. The cleanup was so extensive that NBC had to extend the commercial break just to make the set usable for the next guest, causing a rare disruption to the show's precisely timed format. When the cameras finally returned, Carson had changed his jacket, but the visible stains on the carpet remained as a reminder of the hurricane that had just hit the studio. Carson later quipped that he couldn't afford the cleaning bills to have them back together, but as chaotic as that was, it was nothing compared to the wardrobe malfunction that was about to happen next. If Burt Reynolds attacked Johnny's wardrobe, Zsa Zsa Gabor attacked his sense of propriety, creating a moment of television history that left the host blushing. The Hungarian-born socialite was a frequent flyer on The Tonight Show, having made over 100 appearances, where she reliably delivered the kind of old-school Hollywood glamour and outrageous anecdotes that Carson appreciated. Viewers tuned in expecting her usual trademark tales of diamonds, divorces, and wealthy husbands. But during this notorious 1979 appearance, Gabor decided to show rather than just tell. The interview began typically enough, with Gabor entering in a cloud of perfume and furs. But when Carson innocently asked about her recent vacation to the south of France, the segment took a sharp turn into the surreal. What happened next left even the unflappable host momentarily stunned. Instead of answering the question, Gabor suddenly reached into her purse and triumphantly pulled out a skimpy gold bikini, announcing to a visibly startled Carson, "This, Johnny, darling, is what I was wearing when I met my fourth husband on the beach at Cannes." The audience erupted in surprised laughter, but Gabor wasn't finished with the visual gag. She insisted that Carson hold the bikini top against his chest, creating a ridiculous image that trapped the host between maintaining his dignity and keeping the bit entertaining. Carson complied with a look of complex amusement and mortification, but Zsa Zsa was just warming up for the punchline that would nearly stop the show. Still holding the swimwear, she launched into a detailed and uncomfortably candid account of the romantic encounter that followed her beach meeting. She described how her future husband had been unable to resist her in that particular swimsuit, following her back to her hotel and knocking on her door immediately after seeing her. With a suggestive flutter of her eyelashes that played to the back of the room, she declared, "And let me tell you, darling, he did not come to borrow sugar." Carson attempted to regain control of the runaway interview, trying to steer the conversation back to safer territory. He gently suggested that perhaps these gentlemen might prefer that these intimate stories remain private, acting as the voice of reason against her unfiltered storytelling. But Gabor swatted away his concern with a wave of her bejeweled hand, delivering one of the most famous lines in the show's history. "Privacy is for ugly people, darling. When you look like Zsa Zsa, you want the world to know." It was a moment that highlighted her complete immunity to embarrassment. Unlike other guests who might be affected by substances or anger, Gabor was simply uninhibited by the conventional social limits that governed television in that era. By the time the segment finally ended, Carson's usual cool demeanor had been replaced by the slightly dazed expression of a man who had survived a natural disaster. As the show cut to commercial, cameras caught him carefully handing the gold bikini back to Gabor, using just his thumb and forefinger, as though even touching it might implicate him in her scandalous tales. It was a masterclass in how a guest could dominate a segment through sheer force of personality, leaving the king of late night holding the bag, or in this case, the bikini. But while Zsa Zsa used charm to disarm Johnny, our next guest used something far more volatile, bringing a manic energy that felt dangerously close to violence. While many guests brought chaos to The Tonight Show through incompetence or intoxication, Jerry Lewis brought a chaos that was entirely calculated and utterly dominating. He was a titan of industry, a comedy genius who had conquered Hollywood, but his appearances with Johnny Carson were often less about conversation and more about a high-stakes battle for control. Lewis didn't just visit the set, he invaded it. Unlike the lovable, accidental mayhem of Adam DeLuise, Lewis brought a manic, almost aggressive energy to the stage that often left Carson looking like a bystander on his own program. He was a force of nature who refused to play by the rules of the guest chair, turning a standard interview into a one-man variety show, where the host was reduced to a mere prop. The physical dynamic during a Jerry Lewis segment was fascinating and frequently uncomfortable to watch. He famously refused to sit still, often climbing onto the desk, rearranging the carefully placed props, or running into the audience to command the room from a different angle. There was a restless, kinetic energy to him that seemed to suck the air out of the studio, forcing everyone, including Johnny, to operate on his frequency. Carson, who was used to being the captain of the ship, often had to sit back and simply endure the storm, smiling tight-lipped as Lewis dismantled the carefully structured rhythm of the show. It was a power play in its purest form, a demonstration of who really owned the room the moment the camera light went on. What made these moments so high retention, and what keeps them engaging decades later, was the palpable element of danger lurking beneath the slapstick. There was always an underlying tension in his appearances, a sense that his zany persona was a thin veil over a notoriously volatile temper. Recent reports and retrospective rumors about Lewis's behavior behind the scenes have only amplified this perception, giving these classic clips a darker, more intriguing subtext. When you watch him interrupt Johnny or physically invade his personal space, it doesn't just look like comedy anymore. It looks like a psychological skirmish. You get the sense that if Johnny had pushed back too hard, the fun could have turned into genuine hostility in an instant. This need for dominance often manifested in ways that bordered on disrespect, testing Carson's patience to its absolute limit. Lewis would frequently talk over the host, answer questions that weren't asked, and aggressively court the camera, ensuring that the audience's eyes never left him for a second. While Carson was the master of the redirect, smoothly guiding a wandering guest back to the topic, Lewis was immune to these subtle social cues. He operated with a bulldozer mentality, flattening the usual give and take of a talk show conversation until only his voice remained. It was captivating television, but for all the wrong reasons. You weren't watching to hear what he had to say. You were watching to see if the host would finally snap. Ultimately, Jerry Lewis represented the darker side of the unhinged guest, the person who isn't just having fun, but who needs to win the interaction at any cost. While other guests might have broken the set or broken the rules, Lewis tried to break the host's authority. He turned the interview into a test of endurance for Carson, proving that even the king of late night could be silenced by a loud enough voice. But if Jerry Lewis wanted to dominate the room with volume and energy, our next guest wanted to seduce it, and she made the network censors panic like never before. When Madonna appeared on The Tonight Show in May 1987, she was at the absolute height of her provocateur phase, a cultural phenomenon who was actively redefining what was acceptable for a female artist. Her Who's That Girl tour was about to launch, and she had already established a reputation for deliberately courting controversy. But even Johnny Carson, who had interviewed thousands of celebrities over his 30-year career, seemed genuinely unprepared for her determination to shock his largely middle American audience. From the moment she walked onto the stage in a black lace outfit that barely met broadcast standards, the dynamic was palpably off. Instead of taking her seat at a respectful distance, she immediately positioned herself unusually close to Carson, deliberately invading the personal space he carefully maintained for interviews. The interview escalated quickly from merely flirtatious to overtly sexual, bypassing the standard promotional banner entirely. When Carson asked about her upcoming film, Who's That Girl?, Madonna didn't give the typical rehearsed answers about the plot or her co-stars. Instead, she complained that the studio wouldn't let her do the really fun stuff, proceeding to describe a scene that had been cut from the film in surprisingly explicit detail. She told the host, "I can show you exactly what got cut if you want to come back to my hotel later," delivering the line with a deliberate wink at the camera that sent shockwaves through the studio and left the host momentarily speechless. Behind the scenes, the situation was chaotic. The network censor was in an absolute panic, forced to activate the 5-second delay button multiple times during a single interview, an unprecedented occurrence for a show that usually stayed well within broadcast standards. The audio engineer later remembered the booth being in total panic mode as they tried to catch her explicit comments before they reached millions of living rooms across the country. While viewers at home heard brief silences, the studio audience heard everything, reacting with a mixture of shocked gasps and titillated laughter that signaled just how far off the rails the segment had gone. Carson, realizing the interview was veering dangerously out of control, attempted to reassert his authority with humor, quipping that he was starting to think he should have booked Mother Teresa instead of the Material Girl. But Madonna was undeterred by his attempt to diffuse the tension. She responded by placing her hand on Carson's knee, a gesture of physical intimacy that crossed one of television's unspoken boundaries. Physical contact between host and guest was extremely rare on The Tonight Show, unless initiated by Carson himself. And this move was a clear signal that she was the one driving the interaction. Leaning in, she stage whispered into her microphone, "You can handle me, Johnny. I promise I won't bite unless you want me to." The camera caught Carson's expression transforming from professional amusement to genuine discomfort. He tugged at his tie and wiped his brow in an uncharacteristic display of stress. It was a calculated power play, executed with precision. She wasn't just flirting. She was proving she could make the most powerful man in television sweat on his own set. While Madonna was an invited guest who went rogue, our final entry is perhaps the most shocking of all, because he wasn't even supposed to be there. In 1976, Johnny Carson was in the middle of a routine, seemingly predictable interview with actor Robert Blake, the star of the hit series Beretta. The show was proceeding exactly according to the schedule. The conversation was flowing normally, and the audience was settled in for a standard segment. But the atmosphere changed in an instant when a commotion erupted from backstage, shattering the calm of the studio. Without any introduction from Ed McMahon, without a single cue card, and without any warning to the producers, the legendary insult comic Don Rickles suddenly burst through the curtains. Rickles hadn't even been booked for the show that night. He was actually filming a different program next door, The Dinah Shore Show, and was still wearing the heavy stage makeup from that appearance when he decided to go rogue. Charging onto the set like a bull in a china shop, he bellowed, Johnny, I heard you were saying terrible things about me." Carson's face registered genuine shock. This wasn't a planned bit or a rehearsed skit, and for a split second, the host looked toward the wings with a "what is happening" expression before his professional instincts kicked in. Rickles didn't just pop in for a quick wave and a laugh. He effectively hijacked the entire segment. He pulled up a chair and physically inserted himself between Carson and a bewildered Robert Blake, who found himself suddenly demoted to a spectator in his own interview. "Don't mind me, Bobby," Rickles announced to the actor. "I'm just here to make sure Johnny doesn't bore America to death." For the next 20 minutes, it was unscripted chaos as Rickles completely dominated the conversation, ignoring the host's questions and turning the interview into a rapid-fire assault of insults that left no one safe. The invasion took a turn for the personal when Rickles turned his attention to Carson's famous desk, territory that was traditionally off-limits to guests. He grabbed Carson's coffee mug, peered inside, and exposed a trade secret on live television. "Water? You cheap bastard!" he screamed, looking at the audience in mock horror. "The biggest star in television, and you can't even spring for real coffee?" He then began rifling through Carson's private desk drawers, pulling out a comb and a mirror and mocking Johnny's vanity, while the host tried futilely to close the drawers and protect his privacy.